What if memory could freeze? Not in your mind, not in stone, but in the earth itself, held in the still breath of glaciers where no hand dared to dig. They told you stories of fire and axes, of longships with carved teeth and men who roared into battle. But what if the fiercest thing the North ever knew wasn't war? What if it was silence? You were taught that Vikings worshipped thunder, raised horns to gods with hammer fists. But not all of them did. In the dark valleys, far from the fjords, there were those who whispered to the snow, who listened when the wind brought back voices. They did not carve runes into stone, they pressed them into ice, because ice could last longer than memory. There was a belief, passed only through breath, that some knowledge must remain untouched, that it must never be written, only sealed, in frost, in echo, in bone. But then came the men in robes. They did not bring fire at first. They brought time, they brought calendars, they brought names. They said, forget what flows, embrace what stands. The old ones, the ice watchers, they saw what was coming, so they chose to hide the last truth. Not in caves, not in scrolls, but deeper, where time would sleep with it. It began with the youngest of them, a girl who was never given a name in song. She was not a seer nor priestess, just someone who could hear the tones in the glacier when others heard only creaks. She said the ice was singing, not like a bird, like a wound. One night, beneath aurora that split the sky into veils, they climbed to the edge of a forgotten tongue of glacier. She carried a bundle wrapped in black wool, warm from her chest. They say she wept, not for what she gave, but for the silence it would bring. They pressed the object into a fissure as the wind held its breath. Some said it was a stone that pulsed like a heart. Others, a horn that could never be blown twice. No one who lived would say for sure. But they sealed it with something stranger, not magic, not ritual. They sealed it with forgetting, as if, by turning away fast enough, it would vanish from even the dream of memory. Only the girl remained, left behind by choice. She whispered something into the blue light of the ice, then walked away barefoot. Some say her tracks never melted. Years passed. Then came men with gold crosses and soft voices. They did not ask questions. They named everything instead. Every tree, every rock, every breath. They spoke of God's warmth. But in the village at the base of the glacier, children began to wake with frost on their eyelashes, though the hearths were warm. One of them drew a circle in the snow that no wind could erase. Another began speaking backwards in sleep. A third stared at the mountains and asked, "What did we put under the white tongue?" No one had told them. The church did not like these stories, so it built a chapel, right at the edge. They said it was for the shepherds who guided reindeer. But there were no shepherds there, only watchers, men who stood still, whose faces turned to the glacier not with awe, but with fear. When the villagers asked why bells were never rung from that chapel, no answer came, and the ice kept humming. That's when the first letters arrived, not from priests, but from Rome itself. Letters not about sins or salvation, but about the glacier, about its shape, its depth, about what lay beneath. And suddenly, maps began to change, but what came next was not supposed to survive. The chapel did not melt the ice, it only watched, quiet, waiting, as if it knew what stirred beneath. One spring the glacier groaned, not from heat but from pressure. Villagers said they heard a cry, long and low like a buried voice waking mid-dream. They told the priest. He told them it was thunder, but the skies were clear. Then the dreams returned. Only this time, to the elders. Men and women who'd long forgotten the old songs found themselves waking with their hands over their ears. One woman whispered, "I saw her, the barefoot girl. She was standing in the mirror, but the glass was frozen from inside." A travelling monk came next, pale, silent, wrapped in white. He did not preach. He observed. He took soil samples, not for seeds, but for traces of something older. He was never seen again. Soon after, the chapel closed its doors, but no one left. The watchers remained, now with books, not of scripture, but diagrams, lines, depths, not one cross on the cover, only symbols the villagers had never seen before, circles within circles, a tear falling upwards, a single spiral, unbroken. Children said they heard singing from inside, but not human, like a mouth filled with water. One boy approached the edge of the glacier at dusk. He was found the next morning, asleep but standing, his lips blue, eyes open, heartbeat slow as a falling leaf. When he finally spoke, he said, "I found the tongue. It spoke backwards, but I understood." The church called for silence. A visiting bishop announced a ban on all local rituals, even harvest songs. He ordered the burning of old carvings, claiming they opened memory that should remain shut. But some villagers refused. They remembered. They began carving again, not on wood, but ice, small shapes hidden behind rocks beneath roofs in the wells. Not worship, they said, just remembering. That winter, the frost came earlier, and with it, light, not sun, not fire. A strange shimmer, low to the ground, visible only just before dawn. Those who saw it claimed it made no shadow. One woman touched it. She lost her voice for 3 days, but when it returned, she sang a lullaby no one had heard before, except one man, an old hunter. He wept. "It's the song she sang," he said, before she left her name in the ice. He had never told anyone, not even his wife. But now he spoke. He told them of a tradition long buried. Once every 9 generations, someone would come to listen to the wound. The glacier was not only ice, it was memory sealed in cold skin, and memory wanted release. He said the church feared not heresy, but echo, because an echo survives what made it. The watchers grew nervous. One was seen burning pages in the snow at night. Then the letters came again, this time sealed not by wax, but thread, hand-delivered by cloaked riders who did not dismount. They did not stay the night. They did not speak the local tongue. The elders gathered. They said the hum beneath the chapel was changing pitch, growing higher, as if preparing to break. Then one morning, the chapel's bell rang, but no one pulled the rope. It was a single chime, long, hollow, like something vast had shifted, like the ice had opened. Children began sleepwalking. Old carvings returned to hands that never learned them, and a word appeared, scratched in frost on every window. Undone. But there was more. One child, mute since birth, began to speak. Only one phrase. "She's not sleeping anymore." The words echoed without sound, spoken by a child who had never spoken before, a child who could not read, could not write. And yet, every night now, she traced shapes in the frost that matched no known alphabet. But to the elders, they were familiar. Too familiar. They were called breath glyphs. Symbols meant not to be read but inhaled, spoken only in silence, taught not through sound but sensation, like the feeling of cold on bare skin. The church had outlawed them 8 centuries ago, and yet they were back, in the hands of a child born after the last snowfall of the previous century. The watchers panicked. They began packing crates, not of books, but of ash, burned cloth, melted wax, glass that cracked from within. Something had gone wrong. Whatever they were keeping down was no longer still. But no one left, because they knew the orders. They had been trained for this moment, not to pray, to contain. One night, the frost line expanded, not from the sky, but from the ground. Grass blackened beneath a pale shimmer. Candles refused to burn, and those who dreamed saw her again, the girl, the one barefoot on the glacier. Only now her eyes were open, not blind, not human. One man tried to dig. He said he remembered the place. A dream showed him the fissure, exactly where it had been. He dug alone, said he felt called. They found him at dawn, crouched by a crack in the ice, humming softly. Around him, carved in perfect circles, were words in no language known today, except one. An old monk recognized it. He had seen the same script once carved on a wooden board sealed inside the catacombs beneath the Vatican, in a box labelled Rejecta. It had been removed from the index before he was born. He was told never to mention it. But now, the same glyphs had appeared in the ice. Whispers grew louder. The villagers began locking their doors at night, not in fear, but instinct, as if something ancestral inside them remembered this. Crows began to vanish, then dogs stopped barking, then the lake froze in the middle of summer, and all the while the chapel bell did not ring again. It only hummed, a low tone that seemed to vibrate through bone, not air, a tone that changed slightly each day, as if counting. The bishop returned, this time not alone. He brought 4 others, faces covered, voices distant. They spoke little, but their Latin was wrong, too fluid, too soft, like it wasn't meant for the mouth. They did not speak to the villagers. They went directly to the glacier. At midnight, the light returned, the one that cast no shadow. It passed through the village without sound, leaving a frost line that took weeks to melt, and in the center of the square, etched into the snow with surgical precision, was a shape, not a rune, not a cross, a spiral, and inside it, the footprint of a barefoot girl, not a new one, frozen, old, preserved, as if someone had just uncovered it, as if it had waited for the right moment. The villagers fell silent. Even the wind did not move, and then the hum shifted, higher, faster, sharper, not music, not speech, warning. But warning of what? One child whispered it first, then another, then 10, then the whole square. The seal is remembering. They didn't know what it meant, but the ice did. Because that night, for the first time in centuries, and it cracked. It wasn't loud, no thunder, no avalanche, just a deep, low sound, like breath held too long, finally exhaled. The villagers said the earth shivered. A cow collapsed mid-step. Candles flickered in sealed lanterns. A window shattered without touch. The watchers didn't speak. They only turned their heads toward the glacier in unison, as if summoned. Then the snow fell, but not from the sky. It rose, small crystals lifting upward from the ground, spiraling like dust in reverse, caught in some invisible chant. A hunter followed them, alone, lantern dimmed, boots laced in silence. He walked where none had walked in decades, to the mouth of the glacier. But there, something had changed. The fissure was open, not wide, not obvious, a thin black wound in the ice, shaped like a mouth too tired to speak. He leaned in, and something looked back. No eyes, not a face, but a presence. Cold, intelligent, ancient, not sleeping, but watching. He staggered back, dropped the lantern. The flame didn't extinguish. It froze mid-air like a fire caught in a photograph. He ran. By dawn, the villagers found strange prints in the snow beside the fissure. Not human, not animal. Long toes, no heel. And each step pulsed faintly, like heat beneath frost. The children woke in sync, every one of them. Each spoke a different word. But when recorded and rearranged, the words formed a single sentence. She kept her voice in the dark, where no name could erase it. The bishop demanded silence, ordered the chapel sealed, but it was too late, because now the spiral was growing. Each night it appeared again in a new place, near wells, on rooftops, in the frost of unopened windows. Always perfect, never repeated, and each time a single object disappeared, a comb, a ring, a tooth, a candle stub. Each one had once belonged to someone who remembered the old songs. The watchers began fasting, not for purity, for readiness. One confessed in sleep, "We were told to hold the lock, but not to know what it sealed." And then one of them vanished. His coat was found by the ice. Inside the pocket, a small stone, smooth, round, marked with breath glyphs too ancient to translate. One elder touched it and collapsed, not from pain, from memory. She remembered the voice, the one from her childhood, the dream voice that told her the names of things before language. She said, it was her, the barefoot girl. She was never alone, she was a vessel. And then she said something else, quieter, closer to grief. The church thought they buried a myth, but myths don't die, they wait. The wind changed. It now came from beneath the glacier, not over it. A strange reversal, and in the chapel the bell was found split, clean down the middle, not shattered, opened, as if it had rung something unspeakable. And the hum? It stopped. but not because it was silenced, because it was listening, and what it heard was its name, not spoken aloud. No voice could carry it without burning. It was carried on thought, wrapped in breath, etched in the pauses between snowflakes. The villagers didn't speak for 3 days, not from fear, from reverence, a silence like mourning, but older, the kind that comes when something holy is near, and you don't know whether to bow or run. The chapel stood empty now, its bell split, its watchers vanished. Only frost grew across the door, not outside, but from within, and in the village square the spiral changed shape. It bloomed. Where once it was a single coil, now it branched, like veins, like roots, like pathways not walked in centuries. And in the centre, a void. Not black, not dark, just absence. One child fell into it, not physically, but in dream. He described it like this: I stood where time melted, and she showed me a word no one should hear awake. That word was never written down, but it made the milk sour. It cracked 2 windows. It turned the snow red for a single hour, though no wound was found. The villagers began building fires again, not for warmth but light. But the flames curved strangely as if pushed by something unseen, and the smoke, it refused to rise. The elders gathered once more. They spoke of the old ritual, the one erased by decree, buried not just by church law, but by snow and shame, the ritual of re-listening, a right to hear what the ice forgot. It had only been performed once, by the barefoot girl, and now the pattern was repeating. One by one, names began to vanish from stone markers in the cemetery, not chipped, not eroded, gone like they'd never been etched, and in their place a symbol, a rune that meant nothing in modern language, but in the oldest lore it signified a debt, not one owed, one due. The bishop tried to leave. His escort was ready, horses saddled, path cleared, but the road had vanished. Snow covered everything, not new snow, familiar snow, a shape of past winters laid out in precise layers. The monks recognized the pattern. It was the same as the diagrams they were never supposed to see. The ones hidden in the forbidden wing of the Vatican vaults, labelled not with Latin, but with a single warning carved into iron. Vestigia nulla retrorsum. No steps backward. But now they were back. Every footprint from every ritual of forgetting returned in snow, and the wind no longer blew. It circled, moving in loops around the glacier, around the chapel, around the village, a vortex made not of air, but memory, and in the centre, stillness, until one final shape appeared in the ice, a shape no villager remembered carving. It was not a spiral, it was a doorway, and carved around it, like ribs. We were the ones who sang before the gods had names. Then the earth trembled, not violently, but intimately, as if something beneath the glacier had stirred from slumber and now was turning its face toward the world again. And the world felt it. Birds that had vanished returned, but flew in circles, always counterclockwise. The lake, once frozen, now steamed, yet no heat came from it, only scent, sweet, ancient, unplaceable. Some called it myrrh, others said it smelled like old books. The doorway in the ice remained, solid, silent, but not dormant. Villagers stopped approaching it, not out of fear, but awe, the kind that wraps around the spine when standing before something older than belief. One girl approached, her hair white though she was 12. She didn't knock. She simply stood before the ice and began to hum, not a melody, a frequency. The same tone the chapel bell once rang, before it split, and the doorway responded, not by opening, but by pulsing. The ice around it shimmered faintly, then darkened, as if remembering shadow. Then a word appeared on its surface, not carved, condensed, like breath on glass. The word was return. The elders fell to their knees. One whispered, "It's the same word from the first winter, the word she spoke before we buried it, before we forgot." The watchers, or what remained of them, stepped back. 2 began to shake. One bit his own tongue to stop himself from chanting, because chanting had been forbidden, long ago. for a reason no one dared to write, but the hum spread, now through walls, through bone, through time. Old journals flipped open on their own, pages turned, blank ones, and on the margins, the breath glyphs returned, drawn in ink no hand remembered using. The church sent a final letter, short, urgent, a command, not a request. Seal the glacier, salt the memory, bury the doorway, burn the tongues. But it came too late, because that night the village didn't sleep. They gathered around the ice silent, no torches, no chants, only breath. And in that breath, the glyphs began to glow, faintly, softly, from skin, from hair, from eyes, as if each person carried the map inside them, and the doorway had only been a mirror. Then a sound, low, female, but not young, a voice like snow melting inside a cave. It said, "You kept the silence well. Now you may hear the rest." The glacier shivered. The doorway cracked down its center. But what lay behind it was not dark. It was light, not blinding, not warm. A cold light, a memory made visible. Inside there was no corridor, no chamber, only a shape, floating, shifting, alive, but not breathing. A coil of frost, a knot of time. Some called it the seed, others her whisper. But the oldest elder, the one who hadn't spoken in years, said one word before collapsing. Script, the original script, the voice before voice, the thing the church hunted not to destroy, but to contain. It wasn't language, it was design, the soul's structure before birth, and now it was waking. But what it would say was never meant for books, because books have pages, and this had only unfolding. The script did not speak, it revealed. Those who looked into it saw not words, but shapes their minds remembered without learning, curves that echoed through ribs, symbols that pulsed behind the eyes, the feel of breath before birth. The young girl, the one with white hair, stepped forward first. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply opened her hands, and the light from the script wove into her palms, like frost remembering water. Her skin shimmered, not glowing, but showing. Underneath, veins like runes, not blood red, ice blue. She turned, and the villagers understood. She had not been born, she had returned. The church had always spoken of resurrection as a promise, but here it was a loop. She spoke, one sentence, the same sentence the barefoot girl had whispered to the glacier all those centuries ago. Not in Norse, not in Latin, in breath. We were made to remember, and you were made to hold. The watchers collapsed, their purpose fulfilled, or broken. None could tell the difference anymore. The doorway widened. Now more could see, and they did. Inside, fragments of scenes, lives unlived but somehow theirs. A hunter who never fired, a mother who never cried, a monk who remembered laughter. All things buried by systems that demanded silence. The light curled into each witness, not forcing, but offering, and each villager faced a question they'd never dared to ask. What did I forget to survive? One woman screamed, not from fear, from recognition. She fell to her knees and whispered, "He was mine. They took him from the record." She saw a child, one that had never been listed in the parish, one whose name had been salted, erased, and still he had returned. The script did not give comfort, it gave truth, and truth is not gentle. The air thickened, not with heat, with weight, like memory condensed into weather. And all around the glacier the wind began to whisper names, not names of saints, names no scripture held. Arya, Koln, Ivine, Serm. One man said they were the names of the first keepers, those who shaped the glyphs with their own dreaming, not written with hands, but with waiting. The spiral in the village square cracked open. From its centre grew something green, a shoot, alive, in the frost, life where none should be. The church's final rider arrived too late. He bore only salt and fire. But when he reached the square, His horse froze mid-step. Its breath formed words in the air before vanishing. The rider dismounted and approached the chute. He touched it and vanished. No scream, no ash, just gone, like a lie undone. The villagers did not celebrate. They simply stood, listened, waited, because the voice inside the ice was not done speaking, and what it had saved for last was never meant for ears, because some truths aren't heard, they are remembered. And now the remembering had begun. The script pulsed once, a soundless tremor that passed through flesh, not air. The villagers shivered, not from cold, but from alignment, as if something inside them had just clicked into place. The light deepened, not brighter, thicker. It filled the spaces between thoughts. And then it spoke again, not in sound, in gravity, the feeling of being drawn toward a center that wasn't physical, but ancestral. The girl in white fell into trance. Her mouth opened, but no breath came out. Only mist, the kind that rises from skin just before snowfall. Within the mist, moving shapes, visions. The barefoot girl, centuries ago, now clearer. Not alone. She had stood beside another, taller, wrapped in black furs, face veiled, hands glowing faintly with the same light now pouring from the script. They had whispered together, and the elder among the villagers finally named her. Ymir. The name cracked the ice near his feet. He had been a boy when he heard it the first time, whispered by his dying grandmother in a fever dream, a name forbidden, swallowed, erased from all texts, a name said to mean before naming. And now she was here again, not reborn, returned. The ice began to sing, not with melody, with memory, layered voices, male, female, animal, wind, a choir that had no source. It sang inwards, not outwards, a pull instead of a push, a call to roots, to origins unspoken. Then the doorway widened once more, but not for light this time, for movement. Something emerged, not a figure, a presence, a curve in reality, like space had bent in reverence. The villagers could not see it directly, only its effect. Frost melting into symbols, shadows forming runes on walls, hearts skipping, then sinking. It moved through them without touching, and they remembered, each their own part. One man collapsed, weeping, recalling the lost lullaby his mother never sang. A woman gasped as the memory of her stillborn child returned, not in grief, but in light. A boy trembled, seeing a language inside his dreams he thought were nonsense. Now, understood. The script did not teach, it returned what had been hidden, and not all could bear it. One of the watchers screamed, a long, thin cry, not of pain but rejection. His hands caught fire, blue, silent fire, and he fell. Where he landed, the frost receded, like truth had refused him, because truth chooses, and not all are ready. The white-haired girl approached his ashes, whispered 3 syllables, the ice sealed over them, then turned to the others and said softly, "She forgives, but she does not forget." And the glacier groaned again. This time it did not crack. It opened. A staircase, shallow, wide, carved not by tools but by thought. Steps of frost that glowed faintly when approached, yet dulled if touched with fear. No one was ordered, only invited. And the first to descend was not young, not strong, but the eldest among them, the one who had remembered Ymir. He turned once and said, "If I do not return, it is because I was already there." And with that, he stepped below. But what he saw beneath was something not even memory could prepare for. There was no cavern, no walls, just light, layered, soft, moving sideways, as if time had been folded and laid gently underground. The elder did not walk. He drifted. Each step did not echo. It answered. Because here, sound did not travel outward. It returned to its source. He reached a chamber that was not a room. It had no shape, only intention, a space that had been waiting not for someone, but for him, and in its center floated the object, or what might once have been called an object. It was not metal, not stone, not bone. It looked like a knot of frost and smoke flickering in rhythm, as if remembering how to be solid. It pulsed with glyphs, not written, living, and in its every curve he saw faces, not of the dead, of the erased, mothers never named, fathers who vanished from parish books, daughters who sang songs no priest allowed, languages forgotten, not lost, but buried. They looked back at him, and the elder wept, not from sorrow, but recognition. He had carried a piece of them all his life, not knowing, only aching. He reached out, not to touch, to honor. The knot did not move, but the chamber darkened, just slightly, and from behind him, a voice, female, ageless. "I remember you." He turned. No figure, just presence. "You were the last to forget willingly." He bowed his head. "I'm ready." "No," she said gently. "You are not, but you are needed." And then, silence, not absence. A pause, the kind before a story is told aloud. Above ground, the villagers felt the shift. The girl in white knelt and whispered, "He has been chosen to carry it out." "What is it?" someone asked. She turned her face to the wind. "The awakening." The staircase pulsed once. The glacier groaned. And then the elder emerged. He was not older, not younger, but his eyes, they held something. Light? No. Script, flickering behind the iris. Lines of story never told, but always known. He opened his mouth. No sound came, only air. But those who stood close heard something inside their bones. They tried to silence the soul, but the soul does not speak. It echoes. He walked past them all, slow, deliberate, like a prophet in reverse. And behind him, frost began to grow, not random, not wild, in glyphs, covering stones, windows, the walls of the silent chapel. The script had returned, but not to be worshipped, to be spoken, a language made of breath, time, and refusal. The villagers did not cheer. They simply stood in reverence, because something had changed. The church would not come again, not because it had failed, but because it had remembered too. And what the church remembered was more terrifying than what it had forgotten, because it wasn't the ice they feared, it was the memory of disobedience. The script had once spread, not by conquest, not by fire, but by breath. Mothers taught it through lullabies. Fathers etched it into driftwood. Children hummed it in their sleep, before sleep became doctrine. But then the seals came. Seals of wax, of ink, of silence. Edicts from men in robes declaring that what cannot be controlled must be condemned. That memory must be blessed or buried, and the script had blessed no one. It simply revealed. The church learned quickly it wasn't enough to burn the books. They had to salt the soil. So they rewrote the names, turned glyphs into sin, made breath a possession of the pulpit. And yet, even in the deepest vaults, they kept a record. A single parchment, wrapped in hair, bound with silence, labelled only with a question. Quis scripsit silentium? Who wrote the silence? No one dared open it. Not because they feared what it would say, but because they feared remembering that they already knew. And now word had reached the outer orders, that the glacier had cracked, that the doorway had opened, that a voice once buried had returned. So they sent him, not a bishop, not a scholar, an eraser, a man trained not to debate, but to unmake. His tools were not crosses, they were absence. He arrived at dusk, alone, uncloaked, his eyes white, his skin pale from fasting. He did not speak the name of God. He did not speak at all. The villagers did not stop him. They only watched, because they knew something he did not. The script had already chosen its witnesses. He approached the glacier with hands raised, not in prayer, in calculation. He measured the doorway, not its height, its hunger. Then he stepped forward. The girl in white whispered, "Too late," and the ice responded, not with cracking, with convergence. The doorway closed behind him, but not like a trap, like a mouth remembering its meal. And in that moment, the sky changed. Stars rearranged themselves above the village. One fell, trailing ice. And where it vanished, clouds opened in a perfect spiral. Then, in every home, every window, a single glyph appeared in frost. Not a warning, a title. And the title meant what was kept for the last. The elder who had descended earlier looked skyward, and for the first time in his life, he smiled. And memory, when freed, does not return quietly. It surged, not as images, not as facts, but as feeling, an ache in the chest of every witness, a sudden gasp in sleep, a flutter behind the ribs, like wings once forgotten. Children began to draw spirals without knowing why. Elders whispered songs they'd never been taught, and those who had once scoffed now sat in silence, clutching tokens, old rings, bone charms, locks of hair, objects never valued until they began to hum, not audibly, but in the mind. Each item resonated with a shape in the script, glyphs that aligned with emotion. Not meaning, but memory. The glacier no longer shimmered. It glowed from within, as if the ice was becoming transparent to something buried even deeper. Then, at dusk, the sky cracked again. Not with thunder, with light. A perfect circle of aurora pulsed above the village. No colour, no swirl, just white. And from it descended a shadow, not falling, floating, silent. It hovered just above the spiral in the village square. The girl in white stepped forward. She did not bow. She did not speak. She raised her hand, and the shadow bowed to her. It took shape slowly. A figure, feminine, robed not in cloth but in darkness woven like silk. Her eyes were glyphs, her breath mist, and in her voice every woman who had been silenced. "I am not a goddess," she said. "I am what they feared a woman might become if she remembered her name." No one moved. The figure turned, pointing toward the chapel. "That," she said, "was never meant to hold a cross. It was meant to be a mouth." The watchers, or what remained of them, collapsed in prayer. But she shook her head. "No more kneeling. You do not worship memory. You become it." And then she stepped into the chapel. The frost at the door parted for her, not melted, but bowed. Inside she sang. One long tone. It did not echo. It opened, and the walls turned to glass. Not fragile, sacred. They shimmered with moving scenes, glimpses of lives lost, rituals erased, births that had been unrecorded, words once whispered and hunted. The villagers wept, because none of it was new. They had all seen it once, in dreams, in silence, in the parts of themselves they'd been taught to ignore. Now the chapel pulsed with light, but not divine, living. The woman turned again. "This place," she said, "was never a church." She pointed to the steeple. It was a lock, and then to the glacier. That was the key. At that moment, the wind shifted again, not north, not south, but inward, into the mountain, into the silence, into the place where the script had first been hidden. And for the first time since time had names, the lock began to dissolve, not crumble, not shatter. It softened, as if it had only been held together by denial, not stone. The chapel steeple, once proud and sharpened to the sky, bowed ever so slightly. Tiles peeled back like petals. Beneath them, not wood, not plaster, but threads, thin, glowing, alive. Each thread pulsed with a name, not spoken, remembered. A mother, a midwife, a daughter never recorded. They were not saints. They were the singers, and the steeple had been their prison. The figure of shadow turned her hands outward. The threads rose into the air, spiraling like smoke in reverse, rejoining the aurora above. The villagers watched. Some fell to their knees, not in worship, but in grief. The grief of knowing they had once known this and let it be taken. A boy whispered, "Why did we let them erase her?" The girl in white answered softly, "They didn't. We did." Because forgetting, she said, is easier than burning, and the burning was always near. Suddenly the ground trembled, not a quake, a breath. The mountain inhaled. From beneath the spiral square something stirred. Snow melted not into water but into mist, revealing symbols etched in stone. Not Viking, not Latin. Older, so old the earth still shivered at their shapes. And then a sound, low, resonant, elemental. Not a voice, a memory humming from beneath the skin of the world. It said, She waits. The woman of shadow lifted her face to the mist. She never left, she answered. She only listened until someone listened back. And now the ice behind her shifted again. A great shape emerged, round, massive, veined with silver-blue light, like a seed made of time. But it wasn't a seed. It was an eye, closed for centuries, sealed in ice, wrapped in silence. Until now. The villagers gasped, not from fear, from recognition. Each had seen that shape in a dream they'd long forgotten. Not an object, a presence, the first witness. Not a god, not a prophet, a memory too large to live in a single mind. So it lived in the land. And now it was waking. The eye opened. No pupil, no iris, only depth. Depth so vast it felt like falling into origin, and within it, not judgment, but welcome. The girl in white stepped forward. She sees us, she said. She always did. And around her feet, the frost pulled inward, forming a spiral in motion, a path not to somewhere, but back to what had been hidden before the first hymn, before the first scripture, before silence was sacred. The villagers did not speak. They listened, because beneath their skin, the glyphs were stirring, and something inside them, something older than blood, was beginning to whisper, "You are not what you were told. You are what survived. And survival," she whispered, "is not endurance. It is remembering when no one else dares to." The eye, vast, patient, alive, did not blink. It absorbed, not just light or sound, but memory, the unsaid, the unwept, the unborn. Each villager felt it differently. One man dropped to his knees, laughing, not joy, but recognition of a weight lifted. A mother clutched her chest as a forgotten lullaby returned to her lips, and she mouthed a name her daughter never learned. A boy trembled as the dream language of his childhood, once mocked into silence, filled the air around him like song. The script spiraled around the village now, not just in the ice, but in the wind, the soil, the pulse beneath the earth. And then the woman of shadow turned, slowly, toward the mountain. "There is one left," she said. The crowd parted, and from its edge stepped the last watcher. But he was not cloaked. His robes burned away, eyes dark, but not cruel. His hands scarred, not by battle, but by erasure. He bowed his head, ashamed. "I was told to keep the gate," he said, "and I did." "But you kept it closed," said the girl in white. He nodded. "I thought silence would protect us." "And did it?" she asked. He looked up, eyes filled with the smoke of centuries. "It only made us forget what was worth protecting." The woman of shadow extended her hand, not to accuse, to offer. He took it, and the scars on his palms began to glow, not heal, glow. Each line, each wound became a path of glyphs, because sometimes the price of guarding truth is forgetting you once carried it. The villagers encircled him, not in judgment, in return. And together they began to chant, soft, wordless, a low vibration more felt than heard. And the eye, the first witness, pulsed in rhythm. With each breath, frost etched symbols across every surface, stone, wood, skin. But they were not marks. They were mirrors, showing each soul not who they were told to be, but who they had always been. Then came the final shift, a glow beneath the spiral square, the oldest part of the village, a crack, a hum, a door, ancient, covered in runes long buried by snow and shame, began to rise from the earth, not up, inward, like it had always been waiting to be refound. The girl in white placed her hand upon it. It did not open. It exhaled. And the air that escaped wasn't cold. It was alive. And in that breath, a single voice whispered. She kept the last name. The woman of shadow nodded once, then without a word, vanished, her form unraveling into glyphs that scattered to the wind. The villagers stared at the door. They knew what came next was no longer a question of permission. It was an inheritance. And behind that door was the truth even the script feared to speak aloud. The door stood before them, not as barrier, but as question. It bore no lock, no hinge, only breath. The girl in white stood motionless, palm resting on its surface. Her eyes no longer glowed, they absorbed, because what was behind the door was not meant to be seen, it was meant to be carried. A silence fell, not hollow, sacred. The villagers, once ordinary, now bore fragments of script across their cheeks, necks, hands. None had carved it. It had returned to them, as if recognizing the soil of its origin. The elder stepped forward. He said nothing. He only knelt beside the girl and placed his hand where hers touched the wood. A second breath escaped, but this one did not vanish. It lingered. It curled around their ankles, crept through the frost, climbed into their lungs, not to choke, but to awaken. Then the door began to move. No creak, no rumble. It folded, like paper, inward, becoming thinner with each breath until nothing remained but a frame of air. And beyond it, darkness, but not blackness, a depth so ancient it had no colour left. Inside, shapes stirred, not bodies, not shadows, memories that had never found flesh. They flickered like candlelight in reverse, retreating from form, dissolving into intention. The girl stepped through, then the elder, then one by one the villagers. None spoke, because to speak here would be to impose language where only knowing belonged. Inside the chamber, walls pulsed like lungs. The floor glistened with frost that didn't melt, and on it, names, thousands, some familiar, most not. But every name pulsed in rhythm with the watchers' hearts, because they were not reading them, they were being read. A glyph rose from the centre of the chamber, a spiral. Within a spiral, at its core, a fragment of the original script, not preserved, not displayed, alive. It hovered in the air, shedding particles of light, tiny, delicate syllables falling like snow. Each landed on a tongue, and one by one, the villagers began to speak, but not aloud. Their voices filled the space without sound. The chamber shimmered, and from the centre, a shape began to emerge. Human? No. Familiar? Yes. It had no face, no form, only resemblance. Each witness saw something different. A sister, a father, a child who was never born, a voice that had only spoken in dreams, and from it came the final glyph, the one that had never been spoken, the name she kept. It did not translate. It did not echo. It entered each person like a seed dropped in ancient soil. And from that moment, each knew. The truth they had unearthed was not a revelation. It was a return. And returns, by nature, bring reckoning, because something was still missing. The chamber pulsed, not urgently, but expectantly, as though it waited for one final piece to complete the breath it had held for centuries. The villagers stood still. Each of them now carried something they hadn't before. Not object, not memory, but origin. They knew what they were, but not yet why. The glyphs along the walls began to drift, unanchored, swirling like ash that refused to fall. And in the centre, the seed of script pulsed once more. It dimmed, then flared, one long breath. And from that flare came an image, a single spiral. But this one, reversed, winding inward, not expanding, contracting. The girl in white stepped forward, face pale but steady. She whispered, "We were never meant to find it, only to follow it." The elder beside her placed his hand over his heart. "And now we must decide if we finish what they feared we'd begin." A silence fell, but it did not last, because from behind them came footsteps, soft, measured. The last watcher had not entered until now. His face held no fear, only weariness. He looked at the reversed spiral, and his lips moved silently, as if trying to shape a name he wasn't allowed to remember. He knelt at the centre of the chamber, and with one hand he drew a symbol on the frost beneath him, not from memory, from blood. He pressed his palm against the ice, and when he pulled it back, the symbol shimmered. A key, not to open, to lock. The girl in white stepped beside him. "You would seal it again?" He nodded. Not from fear, from faith. Faith in what? He looked at her with eyes that had seen too many winters. That one day, They will be ready, and that day is not today. But the chamber disagreed. The walls began to hum, a tone low and deep, not warning, but insistence, and then the eye in the glacier pulsed again. From above, a single beam of light pierced through the ceiling. It struck the reversed spiral glyph, the spiral unwound, and in that moment they understood. It was not a lock, it was a return path, one that only moved inward after enough souls had moved outward, into memory, into breath, into knowing. The chamber brightened, not from light, from presence. A shape began to form from the swirling glyphs. At first it was only curves, then voice, then warmth, and finally form. Not a person, a question, and every villager heard it within them. Now that you remember, will you remain? Because return demands one more truth. You cannot keep the memory and stay the same. You must choose to forget again, or to become part of what never forgets. The chamber held its breath, not as pause, but as invitation, and within that hush the villagers stood still. Each knew what the question meant, because to remain was not a place. It was a vow not to escape, but to become part of the memory itself, to live as echo, as inscription, as wind in bone. The girl in white turned first. Her eyes had changed, no longer glowing, no longer soft. They held script, not written, lived. I remember the name she buried, she said, and now I choose to carry it. She stepped forward and crossed the spiral's edge, and her body became frost, not death, not vanishing, a shift. She became what the script had always been, breath held in shape. One by one, others followed. An old woman with trembling fingers stepped into the spiral, and her wedding ring dissolved into light, revealing the name of her stillborn daughter carved inside. A young man, once mute, stepped forward, and his first word was the name of a mountain that had no place on any map, but lived in his dreams. Each crossing rewrote them, not into something new, but into the shape of what had always been waiting beneath their names. The chamber brightened with every soul who chose, until only a few remained. The elder, the last watcher, and a child. The child clutched a carved piece of bone, passed down from mother to mother, never explained. He stepped toward the spiral, paused, looked to the elder, and asked, "If I go, will the stories still be told?" The elder knelt. "Yes," he said, "because you are the story now." The child nodded and stepped forward. His form shimmered, then melted into the glyphs. The last watcher remained, alone now. He looked not at the spiral, but at the wall, at the names. So many more than he had erased. And in that moment, he wept. Not for guilt, for relief. Because even after all he had silenced, they had returned, and memory, it seemed, was more patient than shame. He did not step into the spiral. He turned away, because someone still had to carry the breath back into the world of forgetting, and as he walked up the chamber steps, the frost parted for him, not in forgiveness, in understanding, because some are not meant to become memory. They are meant to remind others that memory once lived, and as he stepped into the wind above, he whispered into the night, "She chose, they followed, and now I remain to tell." But the spiral below continued to glow, because the story was not over. Not yet. The last watcher had left the chamber, but the chamber had not released him. High above, the sky had begun to shift. Clouds, once silent, twisted into symbols. Stars moved, not falling, but rearranging. A map, one no eye could trace, but every soul could follow. The mountain pulsed beneath his feet. It was no longer a place. It was a threshold. He turned back, not down, upward, toward the peak, toward the ice untouched even by the glacier's breath. They had always said no one climbed that far, not because it was steep, because it listened, and now it had begun to speak. Each footstep landed in silence that immediately remembered it. The snow did not crunch, it sighed. He passed ancient stones, not markers, but listeners. Each bore scratches smoothed by centuries, but under the moonlight the scratches shimmered, not random, repetition, one word, over and over. Kvinda, the word for woman, the word for source. At the summit the wind died, and in that impossible stillness he saw her, not a figure, a shape in the frost, curved, spiraled, alive, the one they buried before they buried names. He fell to his knees, not in awe, in homecoming, because he had once stood here, long ago, before his robes, before silence. He had placed something at the summit, a shard, a memory, a vow, and now it rose from the ice, as if no time had passed. It was not metal, not stone, a strand of woven hair, wrapped around a broken tooth, human, ancient, and tied to it, a glyph. But this one pulsed with something the others had not. Warmth. It was not memory. It was forgiveness. And as he touched it, everything returned. The child he had been, the voice he had silenced in himself, the woman whose name he had been forbidden to speak. Not a lover, not a saint, his mother, the first scribe, the one who had carried the script in her lullabies, the one the church had hunted until the mountain buried her. And he had erased her to survive, but she had waited, not in anger, in knowing, because true memory doesn't need vengeance, it waits for readiness. The strand wrapped around his wrist on its own, and the glyph upon it moved. It became a question, and the question asked, "Now that you remember her, will you carry her forward?" He looked out over the land below, the village, the spiral, the glacier. Then he looked up. The clouds above had fully formed now, a spiral of stars, and in its center, a name, not his, hers. He whispered it, once, and the entire mountain breathed, not air, light, and below the chamber pulsed once more, because memory had not ended in the spiral. It had risen, and what came next would not descend. It would unfold, like frost becoming breath. The mountain glowed now, not from the sky, but from within, not fire, not eruption, a slow emergence. From beneath the summit, cracks formed, not breaking, but blooming, and from those glowing veins, she returned, not the woman, not the glyph, not the story, the breath, her breath. It poured down the ridges like golden mist, spiraling with ancient rhythm, neither smoke nor spirit, but presence. Below, in the village, the spiral reawakened. Not in ice, in skin. Every person who had stepped into the glyph, every soul who had given themselves to memory, now pulsed faintly through the air, as if they were not gone, but multiplied. The spiral chamber shimmered, but no longer as a container. It had become a mirror, reflecting not the past, but what memory could become when no longer held in hiding. And high above, the last watcher stood still. The strand on his wrist now burned with calm warmth. It pulsed not as command, but as guidance. He turned from the summit, began the descent. But this time the steps were different. Where before he had walked into silence, now the silence walked with him. At each step the mountain whispered old verses, not hymns, not doctrine, but names in rhythm. Names of those lost, names of those never recorded. Names of women who midwived kings, whose words never reached parchment. Names of gods older than thrones, spoken only by wind and fire. And each name returned to him with the same question. Will you carry us forward, without chains? The wind did not howl, it echoed. And below, where the village once lay still, now people gathered at the edge. They had not entered the spiral, but they had heard it, and hearing too was a vow. One by one they stood in silence, watching the mountain shimmer, not in worship, in readiness. And then he arrived, the last watcher, but he no longer carried robes, no longer cloaked in title, only the glyph at his wrist, pulsing with the rhythm of memory unbroken. He raised his hand, and in the frost new lines formed, not to seal, not to record, to begin. The glyph curved outward, spiraling not inward but forward, toward the sea, toward the stars, toward places no scripture had ever dared to describe. The villagers watched and felt something stir in the deepest part of them, not belief, origin, and from the top of the spiral chamber a sound rose, not voice, many, the chorus of those who had become memory, now singing not of the past, but of what might yet return. The script had spoken, and what came next would not be written, it would be lived. But lived stories always leave footprints, and those footprints, in time, invite hunters. Far beyond the glacier, beyond the reach of mist and memory, the church's northern sentinels watched. Not priests, not monks, archivists, but not the kind who preserve, the kind who erase. From ancient towers veiled as monasteries, their snowbound orders tracked silence like a predator tracks scent. They called themselves custodes noctis, not guardians of light, but of night. And the night had flickered, their scrolls turned themselves. The ink in forbidden codices throbbed. Maps once emptied of northern contours now bled fresh symbols. The spiral had moved, and they felt it. In candlelit crypts below cathedrals, bells rang on their own, not to summon, to warn, because the spiral was not just memory, it was inheritance, and inheritance, once claimed, threatened the shape of obedience. And so they prepared, not with swords, with redacted pages, with prayers engineered to bind rather than bless, with relics built to counter the old breath. One relic in particular had never been used, because its origin was older than even the first church record. It was not forged, it was buried, found, then hidden again. A stone disc, flat, cracked, marked in a language no monk had ever dared read aloud. They called it the Unwhisper, because every time it was unveiled, someone forgot who they were. One archivist, the youngest, the quietest, had always questioned it. He'd traced its markings at night, when the senior scribes slept, and once, just once, he had dreamed in glyph. The spiral had appeared to him, not in words, in warmth, and it had asked, what would you become if nothing had been erased? That question never left him. Now, with the council whispering of dispatching the Unwhisper northward, he felt it again, that pull, not guilt, recognition, because he knew now what they feared. It wasn't rebellion, it was remembering. The spiral was returning not just to the north, but to every soul it had ever touched. The cold lands were only the beginning. If the breath reached the libraries, if the glyphs stirred in the stained glass, then the calendar would crack, the saints would lose their silence, and even time would uncoil, because they didn't just rewrite the books, they rewrote reality, one date at a time, one prayer at a time, until even you forgot whose voice lived in your breath. But the spiral had re-emerged, and one archivist, deep in the church's oldest vault, whispered back to it, I remember. He ran, not away, but toward the ice, because not all within the church served silence. Some served what silence tried to bury, and as he disappeared into the snow, the Unwhisper trembled, because even it knew truth wasn't destroyed, it was rebranded as heresy. But heresy is just a name given to memories the powerful didn't plant. The young archivist moved through frost-laced pines, his breath silent, his hands raw. He carried no relics, no ink, no scripture, only the question. What would you become if nothing had been erased? And though snow swallowed every sound, he felt the answer pulsing beneath the ground, not as words, as direction. He wasn't the first to feel it. He wouldn't be the last, because truth doesn't die, it burrows, and what burrows eventually resurfaces. As he crested the final ridge, the land flattened into silence. There was no village, no people, only wind, and the memory of fire. But he recognized the pattern of ash on the stones, a spiral, faint, as if someone had tried to erase it, and the earth refused. He knelt, brushing away frost, revealing not symbols, but names. Dozens, hundreds, not written, etched by wind, by time, by refusal. The names were not in any language he had learned in the scriptorium, but he understood them. They were the names of those the church had silenced page by page, those who had never been canonized, those who had whispered truths too gentle to conquer. He closed his eyes, and the mountain answered, not in thunder, in memory. A voice, hers, echoed through the frost. Do you think they fear gods? No, they fear remembering. The wind curled around his spine, and in it, the warmth. He opened his eyes and saw her, not standing, not separate, but within the mist. Her face was not young, not old, just known. He bowed his head. I wasn't taught your name, he said. She replied, because I never gave it. I waited for someone to ask. She stepped forward, her feet not touching snow, but memory. Do you know why they buried the spiral? She asked. He shook his head. Because it cannot be rewritten, only hidden. She placed her hand above his chest, not touching, only hovering. And now it remembers you. From the spiral beneath him warmth rose. His skin shimmered, not glowing, not burning, revealing. A name he had forgotten carved itself across his collarbone, not assigned, reclaimed. The glyph on his wrist, the same one he had traced in the archives without knowing, bloomed into motion. He was not alone. The spiral pulsed again, and beneath it, the breath stirred. The chamber hadn't been buried, it had moved, and now it was opening, not to invite, to absorb. The woman whispered, You cannot carry what comes next with ink, only with presence. He nodded and stepped forward. As he vanished into the mist, the frost sealed behind him, but not in silence, because the breath had chosen another bearer, and every glyph in the vaults of the church trembled. Even time was beginning to remember, and when time remembers, it does not tick, it unravels. Far to the south, where basilicas cast long shadows and bells echoed over marble plazas, the air shifted. A monk, deep in his final vigil, opened his eyes mid-prayer and forgot what he was saying. The text before him blurred, not from weariness, from rebellion. The letters rearranged, not randomly, deliberately, and the prayer he had spoken every day for 30 years rewrote itself. It now ended with a name he did not recognize, but which made his chest burn with impossible familiarity. He dropped the parchment. It hissed as it touched the ground, like parchment remembering fire. Elsewhere, in a sealed chamber beneath the papal archive, relics long thought inert began to pulse. The reliquary of St. Ivar, locked for centuries, opened itself. Inside, not bone, a shard of frost, still cold, still whispering. Scholars rushed to seal it again, but the glyphs around its box no longer obeyed. They had awakened, and they pointed north, to where the spiral was moving again. But the movement wasn't just external. People began to dream in symbols, in cities, in deserts, in monasteries and homes, old alphabets, forgotten hymns, names their mothers had never spoken aloud, now arriving like breath returning to lungs long silenced. They woke with tears on their faces, not knowing why, because the glyphs did not come as knowledge, they came as loss being reversed. Meanwhile, in the frost where the young archivist had vanished, the spiral chamber shimmered to life again. Not alone. The others had returned, from across the snow, from across lifetimes. Not only villagers now. A woman once branded a witch walked barefoot into the frost, carrying the ashes of her daughter. They whispered her back. A man once silenced for a heresy he could never name stepped forward, and the glyphs unfolded across his palms. A child, never taught to read, traced the spiral with her eyes closed, and the stones sang to her. Memory was becoming people, and people were becoming memory. The air around them shifted, as if the frost itself were exhaling, and in that breath, truth returned. The spiral had never been a symbol. It was a structure, a system of remembrance, a language so old it bypassed thought and seeded directly into the soul, not read, absorbed. And now, with enough bearers, it began to write back. The chamber, once thought sealed, began to extend downward. Stairs revealed themselves beneath ancient ice. They did not descend into earth. They spiraled inward, toward the core of something deeper than land, and from that core a voice rose, not in language, in grief, a grief so ancient it no longer remembered what it had lost, only that it had once been whole. The voice didn't demand, it mourned. "Why did you forget me?" The people did not answer. They stepped forward, because some grief cannot be answered, only carried back into the light. The descent began, not down into stone or shadow, but into remembering. Each stair felt warmer the deeper they went, though frost still coated the walls, not melting, listening, because memory, once awakened, wants witness. The spiral staircase led not to a chamber but to a circle, a perfect one, no ceiling, no source of light. But everything was visible, not from outside, from within. It was not architecture, it was anatomy. They stood in the ribcage of something vast and buried, not a creature, a calendar, but not of months, of names. Each rib bore glyphs that pulsed slowly, like heartbeats trapped in symbols, and in the center, a pool, not of water, of time. It shimmered with every reflection it had ever held. Each person who stepped closer saw themselves, but not only as they were, as they could have been, had the spiral never been erased. The woman once marked as witch saw herself singing before a fire, her daughter alive and dancing with glyphs drawn on her cheeks. The child saw herself guiding others, not with words, but with rhythm only the stones knew. The man saw his hands raised, not in fear, but in blessing, without scripture, without fear of fire. And the archivist, he saw nothing, at first, then breath. The pool exhaled, and his reflection blurred. When it cleared, he saw not himself, but the one he had once betrayed, a girl, long ago, who had whispered the glyphs to him when no one was watching, who the church had taken, whose name he had let go. Now she stood, reflected in the pool, her eyes steady, her hands open. She spoke one word. "Why?" He fell to his knees, not in shame, in recognition, because memory doesn't want apology, it wants return. He reached into the pool, and the surface pulled him through. The others watched, but they did not cry out, because each knew he was not vanishing. He was retrieving something no scripture could translate. Below the pool, the glyphs pulsed faster. The ribs of the chamber began to hum, and above, far above, the spiral echoed once more. Its breath reached cathedrals, it reached libraries, it reached the minds of those who had never heard of Vikings or glyphs or frost that remembers. It reached you, in a dream you do not recall, in a feeling you cannot place. It asked no question, it made no demand, it only breathed, and in that breath was the truth. They didn't just bury the glyphs, they buried the possibility of who you could be. And now, that possibility had begun to thaw. But what thaws doesn't simply return, it changes. The pool shimmered, rippling outward in silent rings. The archivist had vanished below its surface, but the surface had not closed. Instead, it deepened, not in depth, but in reach. Each ring from the pool moved through the ribs of the chamber like breath through a body long held still. And as the glyphs pulsed brighter, the chamber began to sing, not in melody, in remembering. Each wall echoed with syllables buried for 1,000 winters, not Viking chants, not church hymns, something older, a chorus of voices that had never agreed to silence. And for the first time the others in the chamber realized, this place had never been a crypt, it was a lung, one carved to exhale memory into a world trying desperately to forget. The woman with ashes in her palms stepped forward. She did not scatter them, she whispered to them, and they rose, not as smoke, but as form. Her daughter appeared in outline woven of frost and sound, glyphs swirling gently around her fingers. She did not speak, she danced. Each step she took redrew the spiral. But now it flowed outward, past the chamber, past the mountain, through every hidden line the church had etched across the maps of belief. The child stepped beside her, not asking how, only moving in rhythm, and the man, long silenced, knelt, not in worship, in anchoring, because this moment was not a return, it was a beginning, And still the archivist did not rise from the pool, but his breath now echoed up through its surface, and from it a figure formed, her, the girl he had betrayed, now returned not in accusation, but in invitation. She held out her hand, and every glyph in the room dimmed, not fading, yielding, because the time for mystery was ending. What came next had to be spoken. The pool whispered it first. They didn't just edit history, they manufactured time. And each person there felt it, the weight of hours they had never lived, of stories never told, of ancestors labelled myth, not because they were false, but because they were free. The church had not feared error, it had feared alternative, it had feared what people might become if they remembered their own breath. And now, the ribs of the chamber began to crack, but not in collapse, in birth. The spiral had reached its centre, and at the centre was choice, not a decision, a remembering. Because choice is not what you pick, it's what you reclaim. The spiral chamber had opened not to reveal a secret, but to offer a mirror, one that did not show your face, but your silence. The ribs of the chamber stretched wide now, no longer walls but arms, embracing something unseen. And from that unseen came a question, not spoken aloud, felt within every person present. Not, what will you do, but, whose time do you live in? A chill passed through them all, not from cold, but from the realization that they'd never asked. Calendars, clocks, years, all given to them, not by nature, but by authority. Time, they now understood, had not been discovered. It had been assigned, branded, measured not by the movement of stars, but by the movement of kings. And each hour they had ever lived had been numbered by conquest. Even breath had been scheduled, even mourning, rationed. And now the spiral sang again, not from the chamber but from inside them. It rose in pulses, grief, rage, wonder, a harmony made not of notes but of wounds reopening. The girl who had danced turned to her mother, her glyphs fading into mist, and she whispered, "I am not gone, I am remembered." The man stood, arms outstretched, and from his palms poured not blood but ink, reabsorbed from every lie he had once been forced to copy. The child touched the air, and it lit, because memory, when touched gently, glows. Above them frost cracked, but this time no avalanche, only release. The sky opened, not with light, but with names. They fell like snow, soft and endless. Names that had been removed from Bibles, banned from records, broken from tombstones. Each name a key, each name a page returning to the book of breath. And from deep within the spiral pool, the archivist finally rose. Not alone. He carried her, the girl, the voice, the breath. But she was no longer a figure. She was a rhythm. She passed through him like wind through birch leaves, and became him, not possession, completion. He looked up, and for the first time, so did time. The stars shifted, not their place, their rhythm. They aligned not into constellations, but glyphs. The same glyphs the church had tried to bury under doctrine, under shame, under rewritten scripture. The spiral was now in the sky, visible, undeniable, and below, the ribs of the chamber exhaled one final time, not as ending, as invitation, because from this moment forward, history would not be written, it would be remembered by those brave enough to carry names that no longer fit inside calendars. But what is a name if no one dares whisper it in the dark? What is a glyph if the hands that shaped it have turned to ash? And what is memory if it only exists in silence? Maybe the books they burned are still burning inside us. You've felt it, haven't you? That ache when you hold an old object and don't know why your fingers tremble. That breathless second before falling asleep, when a language not taught begins to stir. It doesn't speak in words. It doesn't need to, because the glyphs you were meant to forget, they never needed letters. They needed space. And now, space is opening again. Not in mountains or cathedrals, in you. They told you time was linear, that your days march forward, neat and numbered. But why, then, do your memories loop? Why does grief arrive from events you've never lived? Why do you dream of frost that doesn't melt? Perhaps it's not trauma. Perhaps it's recall. Recall of a breath once taken in a body that knew its place. Not by scripture, not by rule, but by rhythm. The spiral wasn't a code, it was a compass. And now it's turning. The snow outside your window carries more than cold. It carries names, not shouted, not proclaimed, whispered, like yours, because maybe you were never meant to forget. Maybe your silence wasn't failure, it was preservation, and the moment has come to thaw, but not with noise, with reverence. The frost does not scream as it melts, it sighs, and in that sigh is an alphabet older than fear, an alphabet you don't read, you remember. Look at your hands, the lines, they form shapes older than your family name. Touch your chest. That rhythm? It's not just a heartbeat, it's the glyph reawakening, the one they thought they buried in a glacier, the one they thought they erased by rewriting time. But time is only fragile when it's forced to obey, and tonight it obeys no one. The rhythm you feel now, it's not random, it's not yours alone. It's the ripple of something buried, not beneath your feet, but beneath your forgetting. Because perhaps forgetting isn't emptiness, it's overfull, a dam too heavy to break, and now, drop by drop, it leaks. The first leak is always quiet, a moment of stillness when your eyes blur and your chest tightens, not from fear, from recognition, not of a fact, of a feeling. You don't remember the glyph, but your breath does. You don't know the chant, but your spine straightens when the wind whispers it. The spiral isn't in a glacier anymore, it's walking through you, not as a ghost, as a guide, and guides don't give answers. They hand you silence and wait to see if you listen. So listen now. Beneath your name, there's another name, one you were never called, one no one dared write. It belongs to the version of you that never fit into their hours, never bowed to their calendars, never learned their obedience by heart. It's the version of you that knew time not as threat, but as ceremony. And ceremony is not remembered in mind. It's remembered in the way your hands move when you comfort someone, in the hush that falls when you light a candle and don't speak, in the shiver that rises when you hear a language you've never studied, but which makes you want to weep. Maybe that's not nostalgia. Maybe it's ancestral muscle memory, waking up. They wanted history to be dust, but dust remembers the shape of the fire, and fire is patient. It hides in coals, in ashes, in fingertips, until someone breathes, and it glows again. Maybe this is that breath, not a roar, not a battle cry, just a long, soft inhale, the kind that precedes a story, or the ending of one. And in that in-breath, the possibility still flickers, that the glyphs were not lost, they were waiting, and that somewhere in your chest, they still are, not etched in skin, not carved in stone, but curled in breath. Because truth, when hunted long enough, learns to hide not in caves, but in the quiet parts of people, not in what they say, in what they ache for. You ache for something. You always have. It's not knowledge. It's not revenge. It's return to something older than fear, older than guilt, older than the story where you were told to kneel before understanding. You were not built to kneel. You were built to circle, to spiral, to sing. Even now, beneath the lights of this modern world, your body moves with the pull of forgotten tides. Your sleep still sinks with ancient skies. Your tears still fall in patterns your ancestors once prayed into snow. But prayer was never a plea. It was a remembering. And remembering is dangerous, because once you remember the spiral, you can't be turned back into a straight line. And isn't that what the church feared? Not heresy, but rhythm. Not rebellion, but resonance. Because if one person wakes up, others feel it. And when many remember, together, books don't burn fast enough. Walls don't echo deep enough. And silence can't hold. So maybe that's why the glyphs were frozen. Not to vanish, to wait. Until you were ready to feel what couldn't be taught. Until someone, maybe you, touched a stone, or a dream, or a name, and heard something stir. Not a voice, a pull, a spiral, and it didn't say, go back. It said, you were never lost. Maybe you're not meant to fix history. Maybe you're meant to thaw it, and in that thaw become something they never imagined. Whole, not obedient, not perfect, just whole. Because the truth isn't clean. It's alive, it shivers, it forgets, it forgives, and it's waiting, not in books, not in ruins, but in the part of you that just whispered, I remember. And that sentence, soft as snowfall, carries more weight than 1,000 sermons. Because maybe remembrance is not an act of will, but a symptom of healing. And healing is not loud, it's quiet, it's slow, it's shaped like breath. You've carried this silence for lifetimes, not as burden, as seed, but even seeds, if never given warmth, forget they are trees. Maybe tonight, something warmed, not your body, not the room, but the part of your soul that froze itself to survive. Because silence is not always peace. Sometimes it's armor, sometimes it's exile, and sometimes it's a promise that one day, when the sky feels safe again, you'll speak, not in defense, in memory. So what now? You've walked the spiral, felt it stretch not just across glaciers and caves, but through time, through blood, through dreams, and now it rests in your chest, still spinning, still whispering, not in foreign tongues, in a language so familiar it hurts, because it was yours once, long before they taught you what yours meant, before borders, before flags, before doctrines with locks and keys. There was rhythm, shared, unwritten, unownable, and you, who thought you were born into silence, were born into rhythm. So now the choice is not whether to believe. Belief is what they gave you. The choice is whether to remember, to risk melting your silence, not into answers, but into presence, to sit with the warmth of a forgotten fire and ask nothing, but feel everything. Maybe the truth is not a scroll, but a whisper. Maybe it doesn't live in books, but in the pause between your thoughts, in the stillness between your breaths. And maybe, just maybe, this spiral didn't bring you to history. It brought history to you, to your voice, to your hands, to your name, the one you haven't spoken yet, but will, because something is still missing, not from the glyphs, not from the spiral, from you. You've walked through flame and frost tonight, not with your feet, with your memory, not the memory you access with thought, the deeper one, the one stored in your silence. And now, here you are, at the edge of the unspoken. The question is simple, but never small. Will you leave this spiral untouched? Will you let it fade again into myth, file it beside legends and lullabies, and move on? You can. You are free. You can close this tab, return to the noise, to the numbers, to the hours designed for productivity, not presence. Or you can do something quieter, not louder. You can listen longer. You can touch the frost that never melted in your chest and let it thaw, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts, because pain is not always damage. Sometimes it's excavation. You don't need to believe anything you've heard. Belief was never the point. But if something in you stirred, a shiver not from doubt, but from recognition, then that's all the glyphs ever needed. Not faith, not loyalty, just recognition. Because when you recognize something ancient in yourself, you rewrite nothing, you restore everything. So what now? You already know. You've always known. This story isn't just mine to tell. It's yours to finish. They erased the stories, but one survived. Yours, not written in ink, not carved in stone, but echoed in every breath you didn't know was ancestral. This story did not ask you to change. It asked you to remember. And remembering is not loud. It does not demand. It invites, like frost that waits to melt, like a song that hums beneath language. You've heard that hum now. It's faint, but real. And from here, the spiral doesn't end. It continues, not with facts, with feeling, not with history, with presence, because maybe the story never needed to be finished. Maybe it only needed to be heard. And now, You've heard it. That alone changes everything. Not because you now know, but because you now wonder. And wonder is what they feared most. Because wonder leads to questions. Questions lead to silence. And silence is where memory breathes. So take this silence, not as absence, but as offering. Take this spiral, not as proof, but as map. Take your breath, not as yours, but as continuation. Because tonight, something ancient opened its eyes inside you, not to speak, to witness. You are not here by accident. This wasn't random. This was return to a truth you never fully lost, only misplaced, in the noise, in the hours, in the obedient forgetting, but not anymore. Now you choose. You can close this window, step back into the well-lit script, say it was just a story, or you can sit with what stirred, let it echo, let it ask, let it name you, not with letters but with presence, because the next page is waiting, if you dare to turn it. If this story resonated with you, like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep forbidden knowledge alive.